A very good evening and assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for putting time aside to be here this evening. I hope that what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is going to be informative. And of course, I welcome any questions that you might have at the end of the lecture. I expect the lecture itself not to go for more than 40 minutes. And I look forward to engaging with you at the end. Of course, the topic is very topical, I guess, and it has received a lot of attention. I hope that I have something original and informative to offer, and I also hope that we will have a fruitful discussion afterwards. So the topic of my lecture is understanding the concept of Salafism in mainstream Sunnism. So the way I have formulated my topic should all indicate to you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. So basically I'm essentially saying that the concept of Salafism in non-mainstream Sunnism perhaps would be conceptualized differently. Yeah. So the title does have some significance, and I would like you to keep that in mind. So the term Salafism, like the terms hijab and jihad, have been absorbed into the mainstream Western media discourse, especially with the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and ISIS, known as ISIL or ISIS. However, much of the use of this term, Salafism, is conceptually shrouded in confusion, even in academic circles. In my talk, I would like to hopefully remove this conceptual confusion regarding the concept of Salafism. You might ask, why should I be well positioned to do so? Well, this evening's talk on Salafism is based on my engagement with the concept since at least 2003, when I completed my honors degree on what I termed neo-traditional Salafism. My PhD thesis, completed in 2010 and published in 2011, compared neo-traditional Salafism and what I call progressive Muslims' methods of interpretation of the Islamic normative sources. My very first publication of Salafism goes back to 2007, and I have been publishing on Salafism and Islamic intellectual history very extensively ever since, including an article this year that tries to explain why the theory underpinning progressive Islam and its approach to the interpretation of Islamic normative sources is much more effective to counter the normative arguments by the jihadist Salafis to justify their actions and beliefs when compared to mainstream Sunnism. So my talk tonight in particular draws upon the following publications of mine. So I have highlighted a number of publications on which I will draw into this evening's talk. Now let us go back to the subject matter of my talk. Contemporary discussions on Salafism in the academia can be broadly categorized under those that grapple with the subject matter from the perspective of political science, including studies on terrorism and conflict, and those which do so from a religious or Islamic studies perspective. The former tends to discuss the concept in a fleeting manner, usually by not much more than identifying some of the Salafism's theoreticians, like Abdul Wahhab or Ibn Taymiyyah, and focus instead on the political, economic, and social dimensions behind the rise of Salafi movements. There is accordingly little interest in the conceptual genealogy of the concept, but also the contested meanings of the concept of Salafism itself in the Islamic tradition. In the area of religious studies, the concept of Salafism has gained increased attention since 9/11. In this body of work, the concept of Salafism has been theorized in a much more nuanced manner. One can think particularly of the works of scholars such as Khalid Abu al-Fadl, and more recently Professor Frank Griffel and Henry Lozier. However, these scholars restrict the analysis primarily to the modern post-19th century Salafi movements that have been described or describe themselves as Salafi. Therefore, I think that the concept needs further theorizing if we want to understand the full theological, socio-political, and legal implications associated with the concept of Salafism itself. In my lecture, I argue that the concept of Salafism in traditionalist Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, and to a lesser extent theology, pertains to a number of interrelated phenomena. So I have listed here these three intertwining elements of or constituents of Salafism. Number one, it pertains to a highly contested and continuously appropriated approach to Islamic epistemology and hermeneutics, characterized by heavy textualism in at least two variant forms: madhab-based Salafism and an Ahl Hadith-based Salafism. It also pertains to an outlook or a worldview that emerged among the third and subsequent generations of Muslims, usually referred to as as-Salaf al-Salih, from which the concept of Salafism itself is derived, or one element of it, I should say, who tried to make sense of the various theological, political, moral, and social schisms that occurred in the immediate post-prophetic period, culminating in a particular soteriology whose linchpin was the joint concept of the sacred past and the retrogressive nature of time and history. I will explain what I mean by these in due course. And finally, Salafism as a concept, the way I approach it in this lecture, also one constitutive element has to do with a theological and an epistemological doctrine referred to as Adalat al-Sahaba, or the collective probity of Prophet's companions, which serves as a defense of Sunni theology as well as a response to the competing theological paradigm embodied by the Imamate or Shi'i theology. I will explain this in due course too. I'm just signaling. Okay, I will explain all of these in some detail. I argue that such a conceptualization of Salafism is imperative if we are to understand the concept of Salafism itself and develop a convincing and effective counter-religious narrative to that promoted by scholars associated with ISIS and similar jihadist Salafi groups in justifying religiously sanctioned violence. Now, let's look at the first element, Salafism as epistemology. Early Muslim history was characterized by a number of very significant and, for subsequent generations of Muslims, traumatic schisms, both religious and political in nature. As a result, a number of competing theological and political doctrines among Muslims emerged, which posed not only a serious political but also salvific problem for the subsequent generations of Muslims, who were intent on establishing the correct parameters of doctrines, beliefs, and practices considered to be in accordance with the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. One aspect of this struggle for religious legitimacy among the post-third generation of Muslims, chronologically speaking, was by linking one's own theological, political, or legal views to that of the first three generations of Muslims, commonly referred to in mainstream Sunni tradition as the righteous predecessors or as-Salaf al-Salih. This would in turn imbue these competing factions with the sense of normativity, credibility, and authority. As a corollary, one aspect of the concept of Salafism, or what we can also refer to as a Salafi worldview, can be conceptualized in terms of the idea of the emulation worthiness of the early religious and political authorities who were perceived as having remained faithful to the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah in relation to beliefs, methodology, or worship, in contrast to those who were deemed, from a perspective of a particular group of Muslims, to have deviated from the same. Moreover, towards the end of the second Islamic century, this Salafi-embedded worldview started to shape the epistemological boundaries of the Islamic thought, particularly in relation to the increased importance of Sunnah and what was considered by some Muslim groups, such as the Ahl Hadith, its documentation in the form of written reports about the early Muslim community, known as the Hadith or the Akhbar, through a chain of narrators whose ultimate linchpins were the companions of the Prophet. In this context, in what became mainstream Sunnism, the mechanism that was developed to authenticate Sunnah depended entirely epistemologically on upholding the collective moral probity of all of the Prophet's companions, as well as adopting an expansive definition of a companion. Because companions acted as the bridges to the Prophet himself, and on which the authenticity of the isnad-based system of hadith depended. I will say much more about this when I discuss the doctrine known as the collective probity of the companions and its function and nature later on in the lecture. The increased epistemological importance of the Salafi worldview is, for example, evident from the fact that the founders or initiators of the various Islamic sciences, such as the Islamic schools of law, the madhahib, sought the ideas and the views among the Salaf al-Salih as intellectual antecedents in order to bestow legitimacy to their own respective disciplines. A noted pioneer of modern Islamic studies in the West by the name of Ignat Goltzia aptly notes this function of Salafism by stating as follows, and I quote, "As such, the imitation of the Salaf, the pious ancestors who formed their habits under the eyes and on the example of the Prophet, became the ideal of the pious Muslims. Gradually, Salafi, that is the one who imitates his ancestors, becomes the supreme title of praise in pious society." End of quote. Importantly, while we can find many references to the term Salafi in the late formative and post-formative periods of Islam, this term simply designated a person who is considered to be pious or is considered possessing various kinds of noble characteristics and virtues such as honesty and fairness. However, and this is a very important point, Salafi did not mean a particular approach to Islamic legal theory or systematic theology. In other words, using traditional Islamic nomenclature, the term Salafi in early Islam did not refer to a particular manhaj, as some contemporary proponents of Salafism want us to believe. This is because such Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic legal theory were only starting to develop. The centrality of the concept of the imitation of the Salaf in the Sunni Islamic tradition can be further gleaned from the fact that Muslim scholars' views regarding the Salaf have significant implications regarding whether or not their views could be considered part of the Sunni orthodoxy, as any Sunni theologians aspiring to transcend what they took to be the Salaf's way in religion had always had to justify such transgression to their contemporaries and also to themselves. This Salafi worldview also had a profound effect on the nature of Islamic law. To appreciate this point, we need to elaborate on the nature of Islamic law itself. In essence, Islamic law can be characterized as being a discourse embedded in the larger oral-based framework that privileges what Sueya refers to as authoritative parlance of certain individuals, such as the Prophet Muhammad himself, or the caliphs, or the founders of the major madhahib, who are considered to be authoritative by the Muslim community. In other words, the authority in Islamic law is first and foremost epistemic in nature. As a result of reasoning of these authoritative individuals over time, accumulation of legal precedents took place and became considered as binding on the Muslim community in general, because these were seen to be in accordance with the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. This situation, in turn, gave rise to the concept of taqlid. Taqlid is a legal mechanism whereby, rather than abandoning existing legal theory rules in favor of a new approach, a jurist develops new interpretations within the framework of the established madhab-based approach. This legal mechanism's primary purpose was to ensure that the legal opinion of the jurist is able to gain wider acceptance by embedding it into the sacred past of the ancestors, pious ancestors, which is, as I shall argue later, is another major constituting element of the concept of Salafism or the Salafi worldview. For the madhab-based approach, this consensus of madhab scholars is the ultimate criterion in determining the compliance or otherwise of a particular legal principle with the Quran and the Sunnah. However, the taqlid-based approach of the madhahib is resisted by another approach to Islamic intellectual history embodied by the Ahl al-Hadith approach or madhab, which, while sharing the same overall Salafi worldview, considers that the only correct way to access the Salafi manhaj is by adhering to something called ittiba. For our purposes, this concept translates into the idea that the Ahl al-Hadith manhaj that is rooted in a hadith-based concept of Sunnah is considered to be the manhaj of the Salaf themselves. The concept of Salafism as an invariable element within the Islamic conscience has therefore formed the conceptual foundation for the adoption of both madhab and Ahl al-Hadith based approaches to the Islamic tradition. The French scholar of Islam, Chamon, terms the madhab-based approach genuine traditionalism and argues that its function is to attempt, and I quote, to neutralize the evolutionary effects linked with the tension between an ideal past and a present, always on the side of the ideal past. The Ahl al-Hadith based approach that Chamon terms Salafiyah, and that can be either modern or ancient, and I quote, continually endeavors to update the changes conceived as deviations and innovations, bid'ah, believed to be necessary in view of restoring in all respects of the ideal past of the Salaf. I understand that this is quite theoretical, but you will see how all these various threads coalesce into a coherent whole, hopefully. As such, these two approaches, the madhab taqlid based approach and the Ahl al-Hadith ittiba based approach, constantly challenged and continue to challenge each other to the present times, competing for authenticity, as evident in the contemporary debates between the so-called Khalaf or the madhab-based scholars and the so-called Salaf or the Ahl al-Hadith-based scholars. It is also worth noting that the identity and the chronological cut-off period of who the Salafu Salih are in Islamic jurisprudence is also subject to significant disagreement, because various groups have defined Salaf according to their own orientation and their own school of thought. So, for example, according to one definition, the term as-salaful salih refers to the early mujtahid scholars of the schools of the madhahib who are accepted and imitated, such as, depending on the madhab, Abu Hanifa and his companions, or Imam Ahmed, the companions of the Prophet and the successors. Another definition that we can find in the Shafi'i madhab regarding who the Salaful Salih are is much more general, and it just talks about those people who have come first in the history of the Muslim community. According to another definition, as-salaful salih refers to the companions, the successors, and the immediate followers of the successors who are encompassed by the hadith of the Prophet. The best of the community is my century, then the one that follows, and the one that follows that. Yeah. According to Imam al-Suyuti, who was one of the most prolific pre-modern Sunni writers, the era of as-salaful salih is a time period spanning approximately up to the 220 Hijri. But another definition actually defines the concept chronologically as expanding to the year 400 Hijri. And all the other people who came after the year 400 are considered as the Khalaf, not the Salaf. So, what can we conclude from this? That there is significant disagreement, even in classical Islam, regarding who the Salafus Salih are and at what point in time chronologically do we stop. Yeah? So given what I have outlined so far, we can confidently assert that Salafism as an Islamic precept seems to have been developed in the late 2nd century Hijri. As a concept, the genesis of the Salafi mindset is best understood in the light of the political and theological schisms that took place in the Muslim community in the 1st century Hijri. The concept of Salafism gradually developed and began to be increasingly used as an anchoring point for various ideologically competing groups who were all eager to show that their views, unlike those of others, were consistent with those figures who were held in high esteem during the very inception of the Muslim community. This is, for example, evident in the use of the word as-salaful salih in treatises attributed to Hassan al-Basri, who died in the very beginning of the 2nd century in 110. So Hassan al-Basri, if we look at his treatise, essentially he says he's trying to support the doctrine of free will. And essentially he's saying that I am supporting the doctrine of free will because this is the doctrine of as-salaful salih. Right? As alluded to earlier, this quest for religious legitimacy by linking one's theological, political, or legal views to that of as-salaful salih would therefore imbibe these various and competing Muslim factions with a sense of normativeness, credibility, and authoritativeness. The same holds true for the contemporary usages and appropriations of the doctrine or the concept of Salafism. From a historical perspective, the earliest usage of the term as-salaful salih is therefore to be understood as a particular outlook of the post-as-salaful salih generations of Muslims on the early historical events that took place after the Prophet's death regarding the issues considered unresolved in the Quran and the Sunnah, as well as the means of getting to terms with the political and doctrinal schisms that plagued the nascent Muslim community, such as the question of the legitimate successor to the Prophet, the fitna wars, the questions pertaining to the createdness or uncreatedness of the Quran, and the nature and the parameters of the belief itself, Iman, just to name the most significant few. Eventually, the Muslim community did split into a number of competing theological and juristic schools of thought, but under the umbrella of Sunnism, was able to reach a high level of consensus sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century of the Islamic calendar, in form of what now is largely considered mainstream Sunnism, that is at times referred to as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Now, let's look at the second constitutive element of Salafism, or the Salafi worldview. Now, in the context of discussing the institution of taqlid earlier, the concept of the sacred past was mentioned. The idea of the sacred past is another major element of the Salafi worldview, and I turn my attention to it now. The concept of sacred past is, of course, not peculiar to Muslims. As Joseph van Es, a noted historian of formative Islam, points out in the following manner, and I quote, "The sort of backward-looking utopian thought is fairly common. In 19th century Europe, it took form of nationalism. There, too, a mythical past was constructed in an effort to forge an identity, and that mythical past was reconstituted through a slanted reading of the historical texts. For Muslims, a further element has been added, namely revelation, which marks the beginning of historical reality and therefore forms an indelible part of the utopia." End quote. One of the functions of the Salafi worldview is intimately linked to the idea of preservation of the sacred past. The importance of this concept of sacred past in Islamic intellectual history is aptly noted by a contemporary Pakistani scholar, Ovamir Anjum, who argues, and I quote, "In a tradition like Islam, defined by moments of divine intervention in human history in a sacred past, the past remains in some ways unsurpassable by definition. The preservation, interpretation, and construction of cultural memory constitute central tasks for the religious elite, which is made even more significant in Islam due to the self-conscious emphasis on the historicity and preservation of Islam's scripture, the Quran." This brings us to our next function or nature of the concept of Salafism, namely its view of time and history, which is closely associated with the idea of the sacred past. Sorry, still part of that. As noted earlier, over time, the imitation of the Salaf became a very important element of what it means to be a pious Sunni Muslim, as the Salaf were considered to embody the correct understanding of the Quran and Sunnah. One of the important ideas that emerged in the middle of the 2nd century of the Islamic calendar was a direct product of the Salafi mindset, and that was a direct product of the Salafi mindset, was the premise that the Sunnah of the Prophet could only be preserved and remained faithful to by means of a completely textualist epistemology associated with the classical hadith sciences. To understand this intrinsic interlinking between the concept of Sunnah and the Salafi worldview, let us look at the works of a few scholars who have recognized its importance. Again, the French scholar Chamon, in his Encyclopedia of Islam, Brill entry on Salaf wal Khalaf, states as follows, and I quote, "It was the Sunnah rather than the Quran which instituted one of the most characteristic traits of the Islamic vision of history, by imposing the idea a priori that this history was said to have been inevitably followed by a period of relaxation of standards, deviation, and finally of division. It is espoused by a Harvard historian of Islam, William Graham, who argues that Muslim scholars in later times, that is, those who are post-salaf, developed an explicit concept of fasad al-zaman, the idea of degeneration of the times, to convey the idea of the increasing temporal as well as moral distance from the time and the practice of the Prophet and the exemplary early Muslim community. In his words, and I quote, "The original Ummah is not simply a source of nostalgia for something irrevocably lost, but also a historical model for every society in every age that would be properly Muslim or submissive to the will of God. The utopian blueprint is available as a realized idea of the historical past, which makes it all the more compelling as a realizable possibility in every age. It is a major source of what can legitimately be called a pervasive and recurrent traditionalist bent in Islamic thought, one that looks to this original ideal model for renewal. In this regard, the Sunnah of the Prophet represents, for all practical purposes, the Sunnah of the original Salaf." End of quote. In light of Chamon's and Graham's remarks, therefore, another important function of the Salafi worldview in mainstream Sunnism is also to be conceptualized by a means of a particular understanding of the concept of history and time, and their relationship or relation to the present and future. It is encapsulated by the idea of the imperative of going back to what is considered an ideal model of the Prophet's Sunnah that only existed in the past and that was for all purposes embodied in the hadith narrations as authenticated by the classical Muslim hadith scholars such as Bukhari and Muslim. As noted by another Western scholar of Islam, Schulze, this retrogressive worldview in mainstream Sunnism, and I quote, sought a timeless intellectual ideal derived from an origin that was pure of all temporal circumstances, end of quote, and that it could only locate such an ideal at the time of the Prophet and the early Muslim community. This Salafi worldview is often justified on the basis of a few hadith in which Prophet Muhammad himself reportedly asserted that the best people were his generation and then the following generation and so on. This aspect of the Salafi worldview, therefore, differs to a particular understanding of the past to provide all the answers and constantly imposes itself upon the present and the future. In other words, the authenticity of Muslim identity can only be established by returning to a fixed point in historical time, that of the Prophet and the early Muslim community. It is important to highlight that this Salafi worldview is a central feature of both iterations of mainstream Sunnism, the madhab one as well as the Ahl Hadith one. We can describe the former as a soft form and the latter as a hard form of Salafism in this sense. Moving on to the next element. Another important element of the concept of the Salafi worldview is its function of affirming the mainstream Sunni theological doctrine known as Adalat al-Sahaba, or the collective probity of the companions of the Prophet. Amr Osman, an academic based in Qatar, defines this doctrine in the following manner, and I quote, "A companion is anyone who caught a glimpse of the Prophet Muhammad. Knowing the companions is crucial because they were the transmitters of Islam to subsequent generations. They were considered reliable at the time of the Prophet, as attested by his words and deeds as well as the Quran itself. Furthermore, a consensus made possible by divine grace prohibits questioning their integrity and reliability or refusing to accept them, for whereas we are certain that God and the Prophet accepted their reliability, we are uncertain that they lost that integrity at a later time. The inconclusiveness of reports about their deeds, particularly their participation in civil wars, does not allow us to pass a valid judgment on them. Therefore, the proper attitude of good Muslims should be to refrain from discussing these reports, interpreting them in favor of the companions as the outcome of a sincere exercise of personal judgment, or simply regard them as lies and distortions. End of quote. For the purposes of my talk, I am interested primarily in the epistemological function of the doctrine of the collective probity of the Sahaba, as reinforcing the elements of Salafi worldview that I've already discussed. This is because the doctrine of Adalat al-Sahaba forms a linchpin in traditional textualist methodologies of authenticating of Sunnah by the muhaddithun, the scholars, on the basis of the isnad-based system, whose entire integrity depends on the probity of the Sahaba, the moral probity of Sahaba. In many ways, all of the elements of the Salafi worldview that I have discussed so far hinge on this doctrine of the collective probity of the Sahaba. Namely, the idea of a heavily textualist epistemology and the idea of the sacred past and retrogressive history embedded in the concept of following in the footsteps of the Salaf as symbols and embodiments of piety and authority can only be defended upon the idea of the reliability and uprightness of the companions, who, as we know, were the transmitters of Islam to subsequent generations. This doctrine of the collective probity of the companions is also reflected in the very nature of Islamic law that I have briefly discussed. And I have said that it privileges, hermeneutically, it privileges the authoritative parlance of the major authorities of early Islam, especially the major companions, including the first four caliphs, who in Sunnism were actually also able to institute new sunnahs. Final 2 pages. The final element of the concept of Salafism is its anti-imamate theological orientation that is associated with Shiism, which actually highlights the strong sectarian origins of the concept of Salafism itself. In this sense, it is rooted in the doctrine of Adalat al-Sahaba, that is the collective integrity of the companions, that in classical Sunnism evolved over a number of centuries, becoming widely affirmed sometime in the 5th century Hijri. The collective probity of companions doctrine was very much reflective of the reality of multiple and competing articulations of community and authority in the sectarian atmosphere of the later medieval Islamic period. It finds its roots in the theology of Murji'ism, according to which it is not only possible but also desirable to make a distinction between faith and practice, and postpone judgments regarding the status of a sinner. These were the questions that early Muslim theologians had to grapple with because of what happened in early Islamic history, as you know. One such significant competing conceptualization, theological and political in nature, to Sunnism was that of Shi'ism, of course, and its imamate theology, which challenged, among others, the very doctrine of Adalat al-Sahaba, since it rejected the idea of the collective probity of the companions and considered that only a handful of companions actually stayed true to the teachings of the Prophet. To Sunnis, the imamate-based theology, which persisted, even if peripherally, as a challenge to the Sunni social and doctrinal domination, was clearly diametrically opposed to the concept of Adalat al-Sahaba, and as such was unacceptable. In this context, it is also worthy to remind ourselves that the separate forms of canonized Sunni and Shia hadith collections collections exist, and they differ exactly on this assessment of the probity of the Sahaba. Although I approach my talk from an academic vantage point in the interest of full disclosure and transparency, I would like to highlight at this point that I, as someone who subscribes to the theory of progressive Islam, I do not subscribe to either the Adalat al-Sahaba or the Imamate theology doctrines. So, in conclusion, having examined the constitutive elements of the concept of Salafism, we can conclude that the concept emerged from the sectarian context of early Islam and is characterized by an epistemologically regressive outlook or worldview of the post-salaf communities of Muslims who attempted to appropriate the concept on the basis of differing but partially overlapping mixture of epistemology, methodology, and hermeneutics. These attempts at appropriation were motivated by not only claims for normativity and authenticity, but also for the purpose of attaining salvation, as the Salaf were seen as extensions of Prophet's legacy, the Sunna, and therefore the surest, if not the only way of attaining salvation. Salafi jihadist groups such as ISIS are also Salafis in the sense described in my talk today, because this poses some real questions. How effective traditional mainstream Sunnism, not to mention Puritan Salafism, especially in the long run, is in terms of offering an effective counter-religious based narrative to that of ISIS. I intend to hold another public talk that specifically tackles this important question in the near future. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. I appreciate that it was very, very theoretical and very abstract, and I'm very happy to clarify as much as I can.